Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Goldline concert here at Lake Avenue Church for 2021. We've entitled this concert Music for the Soul, and we hope that that is exactly what this music will do for you today, feed the soul. Our performing artists today are the Kairos Piano Trio. Dr. John Michel and his wife, Carrie Rehkopf, are on the string faculty at Central Washington University. They perform as soloists and collaborators all over the world, and today they're here with us with our own Duane Funderburk, who not only is on the Worship and Arts staff here at Lake, but is also on faculty at Central Washington. Our host today is Dr. Ray Briggs. He and his family have attended Lake Avenue Church for many years, and they're involved in our musical life here. He serves as Assistant Director of Jazz Studies at Cal State Long Beach. He's also the Chair of Jazz Studies at the Pasadena Conservatory of Music, and he teaches courses on African American music, jazz, and world music at the distinguished Colburn School in Los Angeles and also at Pasadena City College. Dr. Briggs is going to serve as our host for a second concert that's going to stream later this month in honor of Black History Month. It's called A City Called Heaven, and that will stream on February 26th. And we'll have details about that concert for you at the end of this concert. The first piece we'll hear today is a piano trio. It's for piano and strings by Antonín Dvořák. It has 6 movements, and we will be hearing the first 2 movements. I love it that this piece is our opener in a program called Music for the Soul, because the emotional landscape of this piece in only 2 movements, less than 10 minutes of music, is very broad. The nickname of this composition is dumki, which is derived from a Ukrainian term. It's a musical genre which in classical music has come to mean instrumental music involving sudden emotional changes, often from melancholy to exuberance. So, in other words, this piece has mood swings, but in a good way. In both these movements, you will hear sudden contrasts between energy, distress, sometimes what even feels like aggression, and then very quick changes over to melancholy, introspection, and sometimes even feeling as if time has been suspended. So let the music take you on that ride, and after the Dvořák, we'll hear from Dr. Briggs, who will introduce the other pieces on the program. And now, the Dvořák Piano Trio in E minor.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray Briggs, and I'm happy to share a few insights into the music you'll be hearing today. We've just heard a piece by Dvořák, and while it may not be apparent upon hearing, the composer's intentions were to look into the folk musics of his own region, but also he set his sights on, as he referred to, as the New World. And here in the United States, he paid particular attention to the music of African Americans. Once he began his post as the director of the National Conservatory, he also began to appeal to African American students to come and study with him, which some of them I'll speak to later in the program. Scott Joplin is not a classical composer per se, but he had interest in making the music more of a serious type of art. He's known as the father of ragtime, and ragtime was a dance music that really began to take root in the late 1800s, reflecting the changes in life experiences of African Americans. Those who had recently come through Reconstruction began to enter different parts of American life. In particular, education began to take impact on what African Americans made in terms of music. Joplin had formal training, so he understood Western harmony and the structures that were popular at the time, particularly the march. So when we look at ragtime, what we're talking about is the merging of Western and African American or African sensibilities. From the Western side, you hear the compositional structure, the march and its strains or various melodies you'll hear. And from the African American, one of the most prominent features would be the syncopation. So when you hear the word rag, it can mean a couple of things. It can mean that syncopated rhythm, which means the accenting on the offbeat, which so much of so-called black music has. And it may also mean embellishing a melody, kind of ad-libbing around what is established to be the standard melody. So for the next couple of pieces, we'll hear Scott Joplin's very important kind of merging of these two things. The first piece, Cleophas, will feature the cello and piano. And one of the prominent features in this one you'll hear is a structure or kind of an approach that African American music tends to have, known as call and response. So that may happen, of course, vocally, if you have a choir, lead singer. But in this case, pay attention to the cello as he's playing melodies and phrases that provides an answer and a response. This will be followed by the ever popular The Entertainer. And this piece, you all, I'm sure, have heard, most of you have heard. This one also is syncopated, and it's well known, and I think you'll enjoy this kind of merging of African and Western style. So please turn your attention to the musicians as they play Cleophas. And for our next pieces, we'll hear from African-American composers utilizing the Western classical idiom. The first one is the most celebrated of all African-American composers, the great William Grant Still, who had worked on and off as a vaudevillian. He played in pit orchestras as an oboist. But he did go into composing after studying at Wilberforce University. He eventually began to write more symphonic pieces, and he has the distinguished place in history as being the first African-American to have a piece played by a major symphony orchestra, which was his 1930 premiered piece, the Afro-American Symphony by the Rochester Philharmonic. By the early 1930s, he moved to Los Angeles, and here he actually worked with the LA Philharmonic and the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra. The time period of which you're going to hear music today was this exact era. In the early 1930s, he began to write a series of pieces for smaller ensembles. So you'll hear piano works, you'll hear trio settings, you'll hear violin pieces. This piece we're going to hear today, Three Visions, is one in which he's trying to show he was very much into dreams. He was very much into looking into the kind of subconscious state of humanity. He was also influenced by impressionistic style, so think Claude Debussy. So in this piece, you'll hear some of the very rich, lush harmonies that may be reminiscent of impressionistic style. But you'll also hear some of the vocalizations, which is very common in African-American music, even when it's applied to instruments. So when you listen to Still, it has a very kind of, this piece particularly has a very dreamlike kind of state quality to it. He's known as the Dean of African-American Composers for not only what he had done with the premiering of his symphony, but also his body of work. And so it's very interesting to see how he's merging these two things that seem to be very disparate. So with no further delay, from Three Visions, we'll hear the second movement known as Heaven. And for the last portion of our program, we'll be featuring a piece by the great William Dawson. He arranged it at a time when many African-American composers were looking into their own cultural history for inspiration, particularly after the Civil War, as Reconstruction begins to take place. Many African-Americans, some 4 million, have been denied education for their entire lives. Some of them began to study music, and as they did, they began to see potentials of drawing from Western classical form and instrumentation and orchestration, but also the richness of rhythm and the meanings of songs that they had heard and celebrated as a people were enslaved. So what we're going to hear today is a spiritual. Now, there are two types of spirituals. The original spirituals are considered folk spirituals, meaning you learn them by ear, it's an oral tradition, it's not written down, it's not considered quote-unquote sophisticated. But as more African Americans began to explore Western form and style, they began to draw from them. The first of these would have been the great Fisk Jubilee singers in the late 1800s. By the turn of the 20th century, you hear more composers like Harry T. Burleigh. In this case, he became one of the first to arrange what were considered folk spirituals for entire setting, now choral setting, that we hear more and more used. William Dawson takes a famous spiritual, Ain't That Good News. Now this one uses what would be called Negro dialect, and it merges, again, Western harmony with some of the syncopation that even though we heard with Scott Joplin earlier. This one is been arranged by our very own Duane Funderburk. We hope you enjoy. Ain't That a Good News?